Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's seminar. Before we get started, I have two housekeeping announcements. The first one is that we'll not have a seminar next Monday, November 25th, and we'll resume our seminar series on Monday, December 2nd. The second one is that if you have a question for today's speaker, please enter it in the Q&A box, not in the chat function. We'll have time to address them at the end of the presentation. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nicole Farmer. Dr. Farmer is a tenure track investigator with the NIH Clinical Center. She's also an adjunct clinical associate professor at the George Washington School of Medicine and Public Health. Her research focus covers three major areas: psychosocial outcomes and dietary behaviors, biobehavioral interventions to address diet-related diseases, and translational approaches to investigate metabolite and nutrient influences on diet-related disease pathophysiology. Her training includes a bachelor's degree in molecular, cellular biology, and genetics from the University of Maryland at College Park, and an MD from Howard University College of Medicine. Her medical career includes fellowships in internal medicine at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia, and in integrative medicine from the Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona and Duke University Integrative Medicine. She started her academic career at Johns Hopkins University Hospital in the Division of General Internal Medicine, and then following several years of private practice, Dr. Farmer joined the NIH Clinical Center for a postdoctoral fellowship in health behavior and health disparities research. She then went on to serve as a staff scientist and is currently the section chief of the Dietary Behaviors and Biopsychosocial health section within the Translational Biobehavioral and Health Disparities branch of the NIH Clinical Center. Dr. Farmer is also the recipient of several awards, including the William G. Cullen Minority Health and Health Disparities Research Innovation Award for her research on dietary microbial metabolites and cardiovascular disease disparities in 2020. And in 2021, she was named a Harvard Macy Institute Fellow for her work on incorporating humanities into culinary medicine education and dietary behavior research. In 2024, Dr. Farmer was named an NIH Intramural Research Distinguished Scholar. And on a personal note, I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Farmer for over 7 years. We're currently collaborating on a culinary nutrition project to improve the dietary quality of congregate meals for older adults. And she and I had the distinct pleasure of writing and editing a book entitled Cooking for Health and Disease Prevention: From the Kitchen to the Clinic, which came out in 2022. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Farmer today for the presentation entitled The Role of Dietary Behaviors in Chronic Disease Prevention and Health: From the Clinic to the Bench to the Community. Thank you, Dr. Farmer, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Andres, for that wonderful welcome of an introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to speak to your department today. As Andres mentioned, today I'm going to talk about dietary behaviors in health and chronic disease. And then I'm going to explore a bit of the research that I do here at the NIH Clinical Center, and that spans across community engaged research to the translational side, and also within our clinic settings here. And so a bit of an overview for those that are not familiar with the intramural research program at the NIH. This photo over to the left actually represents what we call the NIH Clinical Center, also known as Building 10. It is the nation's largest research hospital, and it is actually located just outside of Washington, D.C. And I've highlighted here in this map the 8 distinct wards or neighborhoods of Washington, D.C., which you'll see throughout my presentation, actually are the centers of where I do a lot of the community engaged research, but also where we conduct translational studies that look at inflammatory mediators and markers related to the microbiome metabolites, but also related to dietary intake and social determinants. So as my title disclosed, I will talk about clinical research and clinical settings for chronic disease management and prevention, but also really highlight some of the community engaged research that we do on diet behaviors in the Washington, D.C. area, as well as in other locations. And then I'll also towards the end talk a bit about some of the translational science work that we do looking at microbial metabolites. So in the introduction, Andres mentioned the title of our section. It's Dietary Behaviors and Biopsychosocial Health, and it is a bit of a mouthful. But this image here just gives you a little bit, this graphical image gives you a little bit of an overview about what my research section does. So Principally, we look at the role of diet, so not just nutrition, but thinking about what people actually consume on a daily basis. And we look at it from the basic side of nutrition, but also include, as I've mentioned, the potential role or exchange with our gut microbiome. We also look at physiological outcomes. Mostly within my group, we look at metabolism and also innate immune function, such as macrophage characterization. And then in terms of microbiota, we tend to look mostly at microbial diversity and are starting to get into some functional analysis of different microbiome communities. But mostly what I'll talk about today is actually this part of the graphic, and that's really looking at this connection between our food choices on a daily basis, our diet, and how it actually is a significant indicator of behavior, such as other positive health behaviors like sleep or physical activity, but also how we can think about the food choices that we make from the perspective of behavioral science. And so as a prelude to that, I have here, for those that are not familiar with thinking about diet and nutrition from the behavioral science world, that behavior is really an individual's response to their external, which is oftentimes their social environment, or it could be their food or neighborhood environment, and then also to their internal stimuli. So oftentimes that is the self. So that is someone's identity or their psychological processes, like their thoughts around agency and efficacy, that also can drive their food choices. And so this is not news to anyone in this audience, but diet is obviously a key modifiable risk factor for disease prevention. The last 20 years, there has been a lot of attention to the core evidence-based diets and dietary patterns, such as the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, the Mediterranean diet, which has been found to aid in the reduction of CVD mortality, particularly stroke risk. And then, of course, the incorporation of the U.S. dietary guidelines, dietary patterns. Specifically, I'm mentioning the DGA for 2020, and how that really focused on a dietary pattern of vegetables and fruit with a reduction in meat consumption. And then, as we all know, we can look at a measure of someone's adherence to the dietary guidelines through looking at their healthy eating index score, which for a lot of the work that we do is our principal indicator of diet quality. And so a lot of times what we hear is that you are what you eat. And then for those who study chrononutrition, you may actually even say that you are when you eat. From the biobehavioral standpoint, though, we like to say that you are what you do to eat. And so this is thinking about the behavior and action around food that we do every day actually contributes to our choices, and then ultimately to our health risk. And most of the time, the way that we learn about food as humans is actually through the process of learning. And for most of us, that learning has actually occurred in the kitchen. So today, the dietary behavior that I'm going to speak mostly about is actually cooking. And the reason why is that oftentimes cooking is that behavior that we have all had experiences in learning, but oftentimes through the current convenience-based lifestyle or convenience food choices, we oftentimes forget some of what we learned and are not practicing it every day. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show some examples of why cooking as a dietary behavior is important for us to think about when we're thinking about chronic disease prevention, and particularly when we're trying to address diet quality. So if you've never thought about what a dietary behavior is or how to categorize it, this slide is definitely for you. So when we think about dietary behaviors, we can actually put them into three broad categories. We can think about eating behaviors. We can think about dietary intake and nutrition, and oftentimes for the purposes of chronic disease prevention, this is where a lot of our attention lies. But from the biobehavioral perspective, we're oftentimes thinking about food choice related behaviors. And so this can be our preferences, and these oftentimes overlap. So this can be our food preferences, availability and access, which are determined by our environment and external stimuli, our food purchasing habits and availability, our intention. So what are our motivations with regard to food choice? And then highlighted here, which I'll focus the rest of my talk on, are food preparation and cooking practices. So this slide is also probably not going to be new to those of you in the audience. This is based upon data from 1999 to March of 2020 from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And what this shows is that diet, yes, is a key modifiable risk factor for disease prevention, but it is not easily implemented. So if we look at these almost 20-year span, we see that the least prevalent healthy lifestyle factor consistently over these decades has been healthy diet. And then around 2009, 2010, it was pretty much joined by weight maintenance. So as I show this slide, I just want to make it clear that when we're thinking about diet as a modifiable risk factor, if our recommendations actually do not get implemented into the homes of the US population, then essentially these evidence-based diets that have been so heavily researched actually are wasted. And the research that we've done actually doesn't turn into a healthful product. So when I was starting out in this research field, what I was kind of shocked to find was that there was a JAMA article in 2017 that actually showed that less than 1% of US adults actually follow the dietary approach to stop hypertension diet. And as many people know, the American Heart Association has put out a report about 2 years ago that famously showed that around 80% of US adults do not meet the US dietary guidelines for vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. And so, as Andres mentioned before, I started at the NIH. I was actually in primary care, where I did a lot of post-hour clinic cooking demonstrations and nutrition education classes with patients. And this is oftentimes what I was told. This is a paraphrase of what I heard from many patients. Doc, thanks for the recipes and info about how to change my diet, but I have no idea how to make these foods, where to buy them, or if my family will like it. So I haven't tried to make any changes. So after hearing that for a few months was when I started to do these after-hour classes and then really start to investigate what's the role of actually reteaching people cooking in order to actually bring evidence-based diets out of research and into people's kitchens. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about what we know about cooking as a health behavior and how it actually can positively impact diet quality. So overall, cooking at home has decreased in the last 20 years. 2021 trends show that dinner cooked in the US averages about 3.63 times per week. And then most adults actually learn to cook alone by trial and error. And this is stems from the removal of home economics classes during the 70s and the 80s from our standard educational system. And then a couple of interesting studies in terms of thinking about cooking as a health-linked behavior have come out of population level studies in Taiwan. One study showed an all-cause mortality and CVD mortality reduction over a 9.5-year follow-up, the more that people actually engaged in cooking. And then what I found very interesting from this study was that the people that were more likely to engage in cooking not only had higher diet quality, but they were also the ones that were more likely to engage in physical activity on a daily basis. And then looking further, the study actually found a threshold effect. So cooking at least 5 times a week predicted survival for physical, cognitive function, and nutrition knowledge. And I forgot to add that this population was specifically older adults living in Taiwan. And so how is it that cooking can actually influence pathways related to disease risk? Well, when we think about actually what do we do when someone is cooking, there are social, cultural, and economic factors that come into play. There are particular techniques and methods, which I'll go into in a couple of slides. We can also teach and we can also reteach and have people learn about ingredient usage that can be optimized for health. And then likewise, we can also teach them about adaptations for flavor and seasoning. And so eventually what happens is that through this process of cooking, we can alter nutrient bioavailability, energy availability, we can actually find connections with gut microbiome diversity, and then we can have favorable modifications to glucometabolic and inflammatory pathways potentially. Other ways that we can think about the value of cooking, and this may be particularly important for older adults or for adults with increased psychosocial risk, is that cooking really involves multiple different types of skills. That includes cognitive, mechanical, academic, which means understanding the recipe and being able to follow it, as well as perceptual skills that actually can tap into some unconscious learning processes. There are several studies that have found that through repeated cooking tasks, we can actually have an increase in perspective and working memory utilization, as well as changes in processing speed, and then also emotional self-regulation. But now back to diet quality. A colleague of mine, Julia Wolfson at Hopkins, reported on this in 2020. And what she found was that cooking more frequently for US adults that were within the NHANES subpopulation was positively associated with diet quality in terms of measurement of adherence to the dietary guidelines and the predicted healthy eating score. What you'll note is that this positive association was linear for the overall US adult population in NHANES, and then also linear for those with higher income. But when we look at US adults with lower income, we actually do not see this linear increase. And we see that with the more frequent cooking of 7 times or more at home of dinner, then we actually start to have a significant decrease in HEI score. This can occur as a result of multiple things. Oftentimes, confounding factors related to income include food insecurity, depending upon the geographic location of the population. We could also have preclusion of we could also have preclusion of participants, of the population actually being involved in food assistance programs. Myself and a colleague here at the NIH wanted to build off of Dr. Wolfson's work, but we didn't want to follow an a priori type of prediction about what diet quality might be. So we wanted to move more towards an individual-driven stratification of dietary intake within the NHANES sampled population. So what we did is that we wanted to use a latent class analysis. We specifically chose latent class profile analysis because we used categorical data. And this allowed us to see a representation of individual-based classes that people were eating in relation to their cooking frequency or in relation to their eating out at home frequency. And so we published this data in 2021. And so among an NHANES sample population of 11,481 adults, we looked at their dietary recall. We created codes from within the dietary recall to separate out dinner versus full daily diet quality scores. We did start off with the Healthy Eating Index as a way for us to have some categorical measurement of the diet quality. And then we recategorized the 24-hour dietary recall data to actually identify latent classes. And so you'll see here that we identified 5 different latent classes: the standard American diet, the standard diet with low sodium, a healthy US diet, a healthy diet with high vegetable, and then a healthy US diet with lower sodium. Within the NHANES sample, the median age was about 46. It was mostly a female sample and mostly self-identified white Americans in the sample also. And then of note, the number of times that people actually reported cooking dinner was actually pretty high. So within this sample, these were people who were mostly cooking dinner at home. And so what we found is that the more that people ate dinner, and we looked at this categorical variables, but also through continuous, we found that cooking was associated with being either in the SAD dinner with high sodium, the healthy US dinner with high vegetable, or in terms of their overall daily intake, a healthy US diet with high vegetable. But then we also identified ethnic differences too within this analysis, and we saw that for African Americans, they were actually more likely, regardless of their cooking frequency reported, to be within this SAD dinner with high sodium, or for their daily intake in this SAD diet, or SAD diet with lower sodium. So around the same time, we were doing ethnic specific investigations in the NHANES sample, looking at the role of cooking. And so among African American adults, when we actually looked just within the sample of about 2,224 individuals, we were able to then closely a little bit more identify outside of the latent classes what actually might be any value for cooking frequency in terms of diet quality. So what we found actually was that daily sodium intake, consistent with the latent classes, actually did not change if people were cooking more. But we did find that daily vegetable intake and empty calorie intake were more favorable as people were cooking more at home. But then in contrast to the larger US adult population, we didn't find any significant linear relationship with a higher income. So among African American households, when there was a higher income, we did not see that same increase in HEI score that was noted in Dr. Wolfson's work. And then we also found that the frequency of trips that people made to the grocery store within a month really mediated any relationship to cooking along with diet association, which intuitively makes a lot of sense. If for African Americans, there tends to be a higher likelihood of living in a neighborhood that less often has a grocery store available. So we're currently working on doing path analysis so that we can identify what other significant mediators might be present to help explain this data here that looked at the frequency of trips to the grocery store. And so based upon that population level work, I was really interested in thinking about interventions that we can actually start to do with adults at risk for cardiovascular disease and diabetes, but also specifically within certain ethnic groups that have an increased risk. And noting that when we look at that NHANES data, the target populations that we can think of interest are those that are lower income, those who might be using higher salt use within their home, and then also those who may not be cooking frequently at home. So this is just a schematic of how we can oftentimes design cooking interventions when we're trying to address chronic disease prevention. So we oftentimes start with assessing what is the access to affordable and nutritious food for the population of interest. We do some formative work usually to try to identify what barriers might be present for them. And oftentimes that can be time or meal planning or lack of preparation skills. We have what we call culinary medicine classes that occur, but we oftentimes may actually dovetail those with dietary counseling with a registered dietitian, or also dovetail them within a clinic setting. And then ultimately, we measure people's ability to follow a nutritious diet within the intervention timeframe as well as without in terms of their environmental constraints. And then we have chronic disease prevention and treatment measurements. Here's just another kind of schematic of what I just talked about how we tend to think about the design of these interventions. And we really think about how people will implement the knowledge in their homes. So we sometimes look for systems redesign levers. So what are their workflows? What are food deliveries? What are their actual cooking tools that they have available? And then also think about social cognitive levers that can improve their behavior. So we ask them about engagement, self-efficacy with regard to food and cooking, and then do evaluation of kitchen skills. And then some of our most noted outcomes across cooking intervention studies are oftentimes changes for food security, change in nutritional biomarkers, blood pressure, hemoglobin A1C as a 3-month average marker of blood sugar levels. And then also we are always thinking about effectiveness research and then thinking about cost. And then how this really turns out practically, this is an example from one of the postdocs that I've worked with here at NIH. And so she laid out how we can think about direct linkages with cardiovascular disease risk. So if we think about medical nutrition therapy for dyslipidemia, our goal is oftentimes to lower LDL or lower triglycerides. We know that there are several mechanisms by which this can be done, notably reduction in LDL oxidation, looking at gut-derived metabolites, And then how we do this through nutrition, which I'm not going to really highlight here, is thinking about increasing fiber and fruit and vegetable intake. But what we do in the kitchen and what we do in these interventions are specifically teach culinary techniques that actually leverage everything over to the left side of the slide. So we talk about protein flipping, so flipping plant protein for animal protein. We teach specific preparation of plant proteins. We really focus on legumes and cooking basics for beans and whole grains. We talk about balanced meal prep so that people do not cook when they are hungry, because that tends to aid in them choosing convenience-based foods. We talk about whole food sweeteners, friendly fats, how to make most of your own condiments so that you reduce your exposure to processed foods, flavor building and building main dishes. Instead of thinking of your vegetables as side dishes, they become part of what you eat within your entree. We also really focus on flavor and teaching people how to be their own personal chefs. So swapping out salty and teaching them how to add acid for balance is one of the key things that people in these classes learn. And then when we think about how this actually looks, so resources mean that a lot of resources are utilized for these classes in terms of food and labor. So we oftentimes teach people in groups. We go through recipes and instructions. And then lastly, any participants are taught about portioning the plates. And then we have a shared meal experience with the goal that we are giving them a family meal type experience that they would want to then continue to practice at home. And so I show this visual to really highlight that there's a lot of socialization that occurs when we do dietary behavior interventions that are focused on cooking. And so as a result of that socialization, one of the questions that I've really asked a lot about is that in a world where we're all exposed to cooked food, why is it that we still seek out cooking in our lives? Is it just for nutrient support? Probably not. There's probably psychological or social considerations that come from the practice of cooking that are important for us to maintain. And I'm not sure how many people saw this article in the New York Times last week, but it really speaks to another key part of the research that I do, and that's thinking beyond just nutritional status in terms of diet behaviors and cooking, but thinking about how it can food and food choice can actually aid in some psychological and social distress. So here's a picture actually of the current U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. He hosted a dinner party last month in which that served as a jump-off event for what he is calling Gathering Around Food, which is a new campaign against loneliness, and how we can actually utilize food and cooking as an aid to combat loneliness and social isolation. So what we know from the U.S. Surgeon General's report in 2023 is that loneliness and social isolation actually can increase risk for premature deaths by almost 30%. And lacking social connections can increase risk of death as much as smoking up to 10 cigarettes a day. And then lastly, related to chronic disease, poor or insufficient social connection is associated with increased risk of disease, including cardiovascular disease, anxiety, depression, and dementia. Now, about 7 years ago, around the time that I met Dr. Korat, I was actually starting to explore some of these same thoughts and thinking about the role of diet and food and cooking interventions in particular on mitigating psychosocial stress. So in 2018, I actually published the first systematic review on this topic, and we looked specifically at published cooking interventions. What we found is that from the literature at that time, there were reports of improvement in general self-efficacy, so not just efficacy around food and cooking, but general, quality of life, mood, specifically anxiety, but also socialization when people actually engage in cooking interventions. Now, the way that we structure them, it makes a lot of sense why socialization would actually occur. But just some highlights from the systematic review was that community cooking studies all showed a positive influence on socialization. There were studies on inpatient mental health patients, and participants reported that being a part of the cooking group led to a sense of belonging, a sharing of common interest, and an opportunity to enjoy the company of others. But most importantly, and one of the take-home points for me with regard to this review in this topic is that socialization benefits stayed beyond the cooking interventions. As some participants continue to report improved social interactions at home and with family that continued even 6 months after the intervention stopped. So why might this happen? Why might there specifically be this socialization connection with cooking, or this psychological connection with cooking? Well, the cooking hypothesis has been around for a few decades, and it states that cooking is part of the behaviors that actually makes us human. A neuroscientist at Vanderbilt went a little bit further about 10 years ago and actually looked at caloric requirements that are set by the human brains. She determined that ultimately it was as a result of introducing cooking and the heat application to food that we were actually able to develop, in contrast to our non-human primates, a larger number of neurons, specifically neurons that went on to populate the prefrontal cortex. So a psychology collaborator and of mine, Dr. Liz Cotter at American, she and I published a theoretical paper a couple of years ago, really trying to explore this neuroscience data a little bit more, and trying to explain some of the socialization and psychological benefits that have been reported from cooking interventions. So what we have proposed is that there's an evolutionary advantage of cooking, as noted by the work of the neuroscience work and the cooking hypothesis, but that it was important for these psychological mechanisms to actually have a selective advantage. And this is probably that nutrition advantage that happened with cooking and caloric intake, but that in order to maintain the behavior, there has to be a positive reinforcement in place within a social setting. And that's where we think that the connection with well-being and the community levels and cooking as groups and learning from others actually occurred. And that has allowed for the development of not only cooking to become a mainstay of how we use food choice, but a mainstay of how we learn from others. And so to further some of this work, we have published a couple of other papers, really looking at the role of how we can frame the value of cooking through some positive psychology paradigms. This particular slide here looks at the paradigm of PERMA, positive affect, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments. We're currently finishing up this review right now. But we're currently building off of some cognitive psychology work that has already looked at when you have a task-based behavior like cooking. I apologize, I thought that was going to happen. Sorry, I'm just going to keep going while the lights change. When you have a task-based behavior like cooking, we can actually predict that there can be certain emotional regulation and executive attention that happens that may provide for further psychological benefits that can promote socialization. And so how has this played out in some research? So this is not our research, this is research from the rehab medicine field and specifically occupational therapy that has shown that through computerized cooking tasks, multiple different populations of patients, older adults, patients who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and then those who have had traumatic brain injury, when actually provided with repeated cooking tasks, can have improvement in cognition, as shown here through one of these studies, when we look at control versus training data, just to give you an example, so the backward digit span is one way that we look at working memory improvement, as well as letter number sequencing. And here is just a visual of some of the computerized cooking tasks that have been reported and utilized. So these can be as basic as making a spaghetti and meat sauce dish. And then how can we explain some of this for patients, especially with Alzheimer's or traumatic brain injury, who actually don't have the ability to even do some other simple tasks within their daily life? Well, this is a picture of a patient that was showcased actually yesterday on the CBS morning news show. He has Parkinson's disease, but he's able to do rock climbing. And so this really, for me, speaks to the role that food has and leveraging food and cooking tasks for people that may have movement or cognitive impairments, that it's the meaning making, it's the feeling of accomplishment that actually can have some regulation of the nervous system. And so for us as researchers and us as clinicians, I think for me, it gives a different lens to how we look at cooking interventions. As once we start to engage people through that motivation and through accomplishment, we can actually see changes in their function more so than we could with other tasks. And so as a result of thinking about the diet quality changes, the psychosocial factors that are involved with diet and cooking interventions, I have built a couple of community engaged studies that look at the value of this, the value of these type of interventions. And so I'll talk about that next. But I just want to highlight a paper that our group and some collaborators published in Circulation a couple of years ago, where we really tried to lay out from the social determinants, so from the larger macro level, all the way down to the molecular level, what are the connections between social determinants of health and cardiovascular disease development? And then in terms of dietary behaviors and interventions, I've taken this template and really also tried to think about how can we go from the macro to the micro, and then have outcomes for health promotion to evaluate. So in the next few slides, I'll talk about our study, DC Cooks with Heart, in which we have adults who live within a low food access, low income area in Washington, DC. They have multiple adverse social determinants of health exposures. We have them go through a cooking intervention, behavioral analysis. We do molecular biomarkers, and then we are currently measuring their cardiovascular disease risk profiles, as well as body composition profiles too. So a little bit about the area here in Washington, DC. This is an area, as I mentioned, the clinical center is right outside of Washington, DC, and I've already introduced you to the map of DC and the 8 wards or 8 large neighborhoods. But similar to many other metropolitan regions in the United States, there's a significant disparity in lifespan across the city. So the upper part of Washington, D.C., wards 3 and 4 tend to have a longer lifespan of about 81.3 years. And then as we come to this lower part of Washington, D.C., which are the areas that are low food access and low income, and currently are predominantly African-American ethnicity, we actually have a 9-year lifespan disparity that exists. And then lastly, in this corner of the slide, for all of the different wards, the number of full service grocery stores. And this data is from 2020. And so in Ward 7 and Ward 8, there are just 3. I will tell you that in 2022, there was an additional 1 that was added, but there's still a stark disparity compared to the wards that have the higher lifespan in terms of access of grocery stores. And so to look at the potential value or feasibility of doing a cooking intervention amongst adults who live within Ward 7 and 8, we started the DC Cooks with Heart study. This study is actually 2 phases. So the first phase we completed during the early part of COVID, and that was focus groups to look at acceptability of the intervention. We recruited 20 African Americans with at least one heart disease risk factor for that study. And then we also did a focus where we wanted to identify what people's current cooking behaviors were, their diet intake, as well as I mentioned the acceptability. We're currently in the middle of phase 2. We've had participants go through introductory cooking classes this summer. They will go through their next intermediate level starting in January. And then we have finished up a set of three clinic visits, one including baseline and 2 post-introductory cooking class visits for our cardiovascular risk factor measurement. And then all throughout the study, participants complete electronic diaries and food records that tell us about their cooking behaviors at home, their socialization and social network, and as well as their diet intake. And the way that I designed this study was really based upon some early work through health psychologists that have thought about how can you do multi-phase studies that ultimately have the goal of designing effectiveness research. So we have our significant clinical question with regard to the role of cooking and diet quality for people that live in a low food access area. But as I mentioned, the phase 1 design, and we're currently in our phase 2 design. And then within the next year or two, I hope for us to actually start to build onto a waitlisted randomized control study, and then ultimately do some more effectiveness research. So there's no talk about food without pictures of food. So here is actually pictures from our first introductory level class that we did this summer. We focus all of our classes on the Mediterranean diet, understanding that we do have an ethnically homogeneous group. We do introduce them to the idea that the Mediterranean diet can be represented through multiple cultural foods. All of our participants, as I said, live within a low food access and low income area within Washington, D.C. We split the classes into hybrid, so we do 3 in-person classes this summer, and we did 3 Zoom classes, and we provide grocery deliveries for all of our ingredients, as well as for basic pantry items for the participants in the study. And then in terms of what we are looking at, we're looking following that idea of looking at social determinants and translational and disease outcomes. We do look at their food environment and food insecurity levels. As I mentioned, social network self-efficacy. We do an in-kitchen assessment of their cooking behaviors while they're here in the clinic. I have a kitchen lab where we're able to look through their motor and processing skills. And then we do some cognitive testing too. And then we also are looking at metabolomics and inflammatory immune cell markers. And then here's just some pictures of our Zoom classes. So this is what a cooking class through Zoom looks like. And then here are some comments that we received from participants, just letting us know that we've changed how they think about food. And so we screened 52 participants in order to enroll 33, just a little bit shy of our initial feasibility sample size. We had an overall 26 participants that came in for their baseline visit. And then our most common heart disease risk factor was split with high blood pressure and diabetes or pre-diabetes. Ultimately, we've had 20 participants that have returned for their clinic visits. And so far, amongst those participants who have returned, we've seen what has been reported for other cooking intervention studies. So even though this is a low N and there is no control group, seeing what's consistently reported actually gives me a little bit of reassurance. So amongst those that did have a blood pressure reduction, we have a mean reduction of systolic blood pressure of 7.5, and similarly for diastolic blood pressure. And then when glucose A1C, we have about a 0.33% decrease, which overall can be estimated to be about a daily decrease of almost 10 in the average glucose level. And just some quotes from participants that I'd like to share. Being a part of the study changed my cooking dramatically. The food we are using is not expensive, which I think was provided was shocking for a lot of people. And then I'm using the recipes we did and paying more attention to portion size. But so from a nutrition education standpoint, these are exactly what you want to hear as we start to think about what health outcomes might be changed. And so at the top, Andres mentioned that I collaborate with him on an upcoming study that he's doing for food insecure older adults. I've also been able to take this idea of thinking about the macro to the bench to disease outcomes and also utilize them in another study in collaboration with Drexel University at and we did this study at actually a library in Philadelphia, where we looked at young adults with autism spectrum disorder. And then following a similar model that we did for DC Cooks, we enrolled students that were 15 to 21 years of age that had a pre-existing diagnosis on the autism spectrum disorder and who also were from a food insecure household. We did a series of weekly cooking classes for 4 weeks, utilizing an instructor from the Culinary Literacy Center. We had students some students had their caregivers with them, actually engage in preparing every recipe. We did discussions around nutrition labels and discussions around food texture and preferences, which is specific for the autism spectrum disorder community. And then ultimately, we submitted this paper recently to BMC Research Notes, but we were able to see changes in self-reported cooking self-efficacy, and then most importantly, social engagement. So we did surveys of the participants as well as surveys of their family members, and then have seen a pre and post improvement in social engagement too. And so my last part of the research that I'd like to talk about is going back to this template of thinking about the role of social determinants and then really thinking about a very important mediator, the human microbiome, and how oftentimes the role the human microbiome can play in cardiovascular disease development and progression, and that interconnection with inflammatory mediators. So for the last 5 years, I've done a lot of research looking at the risk of neighborhood and food environment exposures and levels of this particular microbial metabolite, TMAO, and then its relationship with inflammation. And so going back to residents of Washington, D.C., we recruited 61 adults not currently in a cooking intervention to actually come to the clinical center, provide us with medical history, but also with dietary intake. We looked at their food groups daily, weekly, and monthly. And then we were also able to obtain blood samples as well as anthropometric measurements on this group. Within the lab, we used ELISA immunohistochemistry assays in order to measure their TMAO levels. And then we simultaneously used a multiplex Luminex machine in order to measure their inflammatory cytokines. But then when we looked at their neighborhood, we wanted to do more than just say that they were from a low income, low food access area. We specifically looked at neighborhoods within neighborhoods. So we looked at census tract areas, which tend to have about 1,000 to 1,500 households. And then we used their census tract information to actually determine their neighborhood disadvantage index score, which gives us an idea of the overall neighborhood socioeconomic status, and looked at some of these key indicators. And so what we found actually was not very surprising, given the fact that TMAO was our metabolite of interest. We definitely found a relationship with neighborhood disadvantage index in inflammatory cytokines. We found a relationship with neighborhood disadvantage index and TMAO levels. We did not see a relationship with dietary intake and TMAO levels within this population. But very important, we found that this association with neighborhood and TMAO was not significant once we adjusted for clustering. So for those that are familiar with doing neighborhood and geographic work, when you adjust for clustering to try to identify if there is a specific spatial exposure of interest. So the fact that we lost our significance tells us that there are a localized exposure of interest that actually led to the relationship between neighborhood and TMAO level. So it wasn't just an association that may have happened just from outside of the neighborhood influences. And then we also were able to show that when this association was present, as one would predict, given the relationship between TMAO and inflammation, that two markers, IL-1 and TNF-alpha, were significant mediators. And then lastly, we wanted to really identify if we could see this same type of relationship with TMAO and IL-1 and look at the impact of it on endothelial cell adhesion. So taking what we saw in the clinic, looking at that data, and then looking at cellular models. So what we found is that, yes, we did find a particular synergy of interleukin-1 exposed endothelial cells and TMAO exposed endothelial cells that were similar to what we found in our neighborhood data. And particularly that synergy led to a decrease in resistance or decrease in barrier function across the endothelial cells that we looked at. And this work was led by Dr. Balmer in the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, who did this work with me. And so I'll just finish up with these final slides. So when we think about neighborhood socioeconomic status and the microbiome, there's actually multiple impacts, so multiple hits that someone may actually encounter over the course of their lifetime that can take them from the ideal higher diversity, particularly within the gut, to the not so ideal lower diversity. And so to explore and build off of the connection between neighborhood exposures and the microbiome, a couple of years ago, my group also looked at the Human Microbiome Project data. So this was initially collected in 2009 at two different locations, St. Louis, Missouri, and Dallas, Texas. And what has previously been reported is that there are significant and predictable diversity at multiple sites from healthy volunteers within the Human Microbiome Project. So the multiple sites were airways, oral, gut, skin, and urogenital. I was interested in looking at the role of neighborhood exposures and measuring that not through neighborhood index, but through the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, and seeing if that could account for changes and differences in alpha diversity, so within person and within site diversity. And so what we were able to do is we did a lot of, we took the sequencing data of we took the sequencing data at multiple different sites at the V3 and V5 bacterial RNA region. And then we matched them to postal sorting codes and zip code data that were available at the time of data collection within the human microbiome data. And then just to provide an overview of how are we characterizing the areas. So we looked at socioeconomic status, household characteristics, racial and ethnic minority status, housing type, and transportation. And then here's a visual example of these are census tract areas within Dallas, Texas, one of the two collection sites. They go to the larger zip codes. We were forced to use postal sorting codes, which are a much larger area in order to look at our microbial diversity. But ultimately what we found was that at the airway sites, the oral sites, and urogenital sites, there was actually significant differences in diversity. So the more disadvantaged the geographic area was, that postal sorting code was, the less diversity at the airways, the oral, and the urogenital region. And then we did, logically, you would say, well, you have a very broad area, so maybe it's just the differences of the categories of these postal sorting codes, these postal sorting code areas, but we did actually look at distances of where people, near distances of variation across the postal sorting codes to the SBI and then to the diversity, and that's what's being shown here. And when we did that, it was actually oral that held up the most. So I would say that from our secondary analysis, we found very significant differences in oral that stood up against a very broad geographic area. And then lastly, we specifically looked at urogenital region to see if we could identify if the neighborhood disadvantage score played a role across racial and ethnic differences that have been reported within the Human Microbiome Project sample at the urogenital region. And we did find that for women, self-identified women who were Hispanic compared to self-identified white women, and then self-identified women who did not have a particular racial group to white women, we were able to show this SBI-mediated effect. So in summary, I know that I covered a lot of the research that we do here, but I hope some take-home points are that cooking is a dietary behavior that is associated with diet quality and psychosocial factors, particularly for US adults. We can find a direct association, mostly for people of higher income. Cooking may also be a behavior that can be utilized for interventions to optimize well-being. And that there are various models for community engaged interventions that we can create and research for cooking interventions. And that lastly, dietary intake and behaviors are really driven by social determinants, and that we can also think about this social determinant lens to correlate human microbiome with chronic disease risk. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators and mentors and say thank you very much for your time and attention. And I will stop.
Thank you, Nicole, for that excellent presentation. That you really covered a lot of ground in terms of where all these interventions can take us. I have a couple of questions in the chat, and
Sure.
as a reminder to people in the audience, if you want to submit your questions through the chat. Ed Saltzman congratulates you on a great talk, and
Thank
he's
you.
asking about how durable the behaviors acquired from these culinary interventions are. So in terms, do they last for a year, longer, or longer?
Thank you. That is a question that I'm seeking to try to understand. So right now we have a lot of variation in the literature in terms of follow-up. So most of these studies do immediate post follow-up of no more than 6 to 12 weeks. And there are a few studies that have looked at how long does the behavior last. Those studies have found that it actually does not last very long without having repeated exposure. So these repeated exposures can be what we call drop-in classes or pickup lessons, but very much like other health behaviors, there needs to be consistent priming in order to maintain it.
And I suppose to expand on that question, I'm curious as to which specific food components are more easily affected by these interventions. The fruit and vegetable portion, the whole grains, the pulses and legumes, the sodium piece. I don't know if you have any thoughts and any contrast between the observational literature and the interventions you've conducted.
Yeah, so that's another missing piece, Andres, is that oftentimes when the cooking interventions are done, they're oftentimes not done in conjunction with a nutritional center or a dietitian. So usually the NHANES food screener, dietary screener is used, which gives a very broad basis for us and not a very specific measure about where the drop off is and what the food drop offs are.
Thank you. Yeah, that seems to be a really good point for us to follow up on. Dr. Alice Lichtenstein it thanks you on a very impressive presentation, and then she says that the points you made about the critical importance of cooking skills and secondary benefits are very compelling. And she asks, do you think we will ever get to the point where universally mandated food and nutrition education will be reintroduced into public schools, like a home ec type of activity to sort of meet the needs that we have for this century?
Yes, I hope that we do. I hope that we get to that point. I don't know if we ever will, but I think the evidence is pointing towards, if we want to think about the health of the nation in 30, 40 years, food skills and cooking skills are critical for us to actually start to implement into the educational system.
And another question I had, looking at the various interventions you're working on, you have work with young adults and the work that we're doing with older adults, are there any specific points during the life course that are very critical to introduce this type of skills? I assume that, obviously continuous exposure is the best, but I don't know if you've observed any specific differences in terms of age groups.
Yeah, so the most of the literature related to that question have looked at when people are more likely to adhere to nutrition recommendations, so not necessarily to cooking interventions. But I think that the lifespan time points would still be the same. So marriage and children and aged parents tend to be when people report, okay, I'm now going to change my diet or start thinking about nutrition. So I think that if we look at that within cooking interventions, it probably would be similar.
That's very interesting. So it's mostly life events rather than specific age groups. Oh, we just got a couple more from Daniel Promislow. He asks if it's too late to roll out interventions in adults nationwide in the US, or will impact only be maximized by starting with early education? I guess sort of it's the same question about life course, but
Yeah.
there's any additional points.
If I say no, we're not too late. And if I can just give one example, a participant in our current DC Cook study is 58 years old, and he ate processed meats every day for probably most of his life. He's now fully plant-based. Making sure to eat his 2 to 3 cups of vegetables a day, and is most importantly bringing people within his social support system into this nutrition change. So no, I think that it's never too late.
Okay. Shandong Wang asks about measuring urine TMAO concentrations, since it seems that there's differential levels measured in urine plasma comparing red meat versus fish.
Yes, thank you. So I completely agree. That work we did was in 2020. It's 2019, 2020. Right now, we now use mass spec for all of our TMAO measurements. And then we are also doing serum and urine too for future measurement.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think those are all the questions that I can see in the Q&A feature. If there's any last ones, if not, we would like to thank you again on behalf of the center for your wonderful seminar. And thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.